got all of our potatoes gathered up and our onions that we had drying for a day or two. We got a full bucket of tomatillos, a whole bunch of cabbage, and a whole bunch of squash gathered up. And then all this is greens and tops and stuff out of the garden. They're gonna start picking tomatoes over there while I go empty this load of produce into the shop so we can get ready for canning tomorrow. Big day of that tomorrow. All right, that is our haul for the day. We got several gallons of tomatoes. We got some purple meaty plums and some yellow meaty plums. Bunch of spicy peppers. That's mostly jalapenos with a little bit of pepperoncinis. A whole 5-gallon bucket of tomatillos. 2 5-gallon buckets of onions with a handful of squash and pumpkins, and about 15 heads of cabbage. So we got a nice busy day tomorrow. All right, so right here we're processing the tomatoes for the salsa. We've got them pre-rinsed, and then we're just pulling the stems into a compost bucket, and then the tomatoes go into the strainer hole. We've got our salsa strainer, which has got really large holes on it, and we just run them through this to get them pulped out and juiced out, and peels all come out in the end over here, and all that peel will go to the pigs. We do this for about 2/3 of the tomatoes in the batch, so that we got a good sauce quality that's going to cook down and cook some of the moisture out. And then we leave about 1/3 of the tomatoes left that we will dice and chunk into big chunks. We'll put those in last minute so that we have some tomato chunky quality to the salsa. We put them in very last, stir them in, and then we go to jars right there. Okay, up to the cooker.
The best part about doing it in the shop, all the splashback can be rinsed off. Oh yeah, and on you. So once we start filling this up with veggies, such as peppers, jalapenos, it will start filling up, and we're cooking off a lot of the water to make it more thicker and a little more chunkier. I like to get right to it, to do all the peppers as soon as I can when we're fixing up salsa. The onions, they're also time consuming, so you go to that next step, but I like to do the peppers. Today I get Everest's help, so he's cutting the jalapenos in half, he's taking all the guts out of it into a compost, and then I'm chopping them finally into a fine chop like this. So then as soon as the tomatoes are boiling, we can add the peppers, we can add the jalapenos for the flavor. But that's how we like to do the process.
Okay, I've already put one of these bowls into the salsa pot, and I'm gonna add just a little bit more, save the rest for the green salsa. So that gives me about that much of the bowl and everything left in that bowl of jalapenos to come into here for the green salsa, which I just finished going through the sieve with all the tomatillos. So that's gonna go into our other pot and start cooking down so we can cook down the peppers. This has been cooking to reduce the moisture in the tomatoes and start cooking up the peppers to get them started. We'll add the onions here in a little bit and let them cook down for a minute. But I want this to simmer for a while so a lot of the moisture can come off of it.
All those peppers I cut just went into the tomatillo sauce. So we have that going, and then we have the red salsa going. Now it's time to cut onions and add to both of the sauces as they cook down.
While we're doing this stage, while it's in the simmer down and cooking stage, that's when we taste it and check for the spiciness that we want. So we put the peppers and we just kind of look at it to see kind of the look of the ratio. And then we taste it and just see if that's spicy enough, we want more spicy or less spicy, and just flavor it up that way. Ola's over here crying over onions. It's bad.
It's bad. I'm glad you had the fan on and open the windows.
Yeah, it helped move the air around.
Yeah.
I just dumped all the onions into the green tomatillo salsa. So we're gonna let those start to cook down. The peppers have been cooking down really well, and they've got a really, really nice flavor in there now. They're spicy. I think it's just about right, about the right spicy that we want. So those onions will cook down for a little bit now, and then we'll be ready to go from this to jar. The red salsa has not had the onions yet. They're still cutting those. But see, we were clear up to here with the liquid line. So we've reduced it down 2 inches, which is gonna make it more saucy and less liquidy for the final product. But those peppers have cooked up nicely. They've got good color and shape in there, and that flavor is really incorporated well. And then we'll add the onions and let them blanch in. The only thing I've added to this, on about 4 gallons of green salsa, I've added about 3/8 of a cup of salt, just to help bring up that saltiness quality to make it about right. And then I have added 1/4 of a cup of lemon juice. And I just like the lemon balance with the tomato and the spicy salsa. It's not necessary. You can do a little bit of vinegar to help with the acidity and make sure everything's in balance for canning. But I just like the taste of the lemon juice, so I do that over vinegar. Same goes for the red salsa. The red salsa has, because it's about 5 gallons in the pot is what we started out with, I've added just about 1/2 cup of salt, and I've added just over 1/4 of a cup of lemon juice. Just how I am with cooking, these are always loose ratios. I taste as I go, and I cook to taste. I don't bother with a very, very strict, rigid recipe. One of the things when we go into the jars is we have to make sure that the acidity is correct for a water bath. If the acidity is too low, or if the pH isn't in the right range, we have to make sure and pressure cook it. But we do water bath canning mostly, and anything like this, the tomatoes are already acidic, and then we add a little bit of lemon juice because we prefer that over vinegar, and we keep that acidity high. Then when we go to pack it into the jars, we add a teaspoon of salt and a teaspoon of lemon juice in every jar before we jar it up. And that helps maintain the acidity so that we have a good, clean preservation so that it'll last for a couple of years on the shelf without any problem. The next thing I'm moving on to is plums. We've got a bunch of these yellow plums, and I'm gonna have them and pit them, and then we're gonna put them in the dehydrator for prune plums.
Okay, so we have all the onions cut. I'm gonna go ahead and put it in the red salsa. As it cooks down, I'm gonna get all the fresh tomatoes that we saved, which I try to keep all my Romas, because they are much more meatier, and any big tomatoes as well. So we're gonna cut those up, and that will give the last portion of the salsa, just so it stays a little meatier in there and it's not so saucy. Once we cut those up and we add that, we're gonna let it cook for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then it's time to get everything jarred. I just wanted to kind of show you my workspace really quick. I always have a compost bin, so anything that I don't like about the onions go in here. And then I have my cut area, and I always have 2 to 3 cutting boards going, knives, and of course gloves I use for onions and for jalapenos, because I don't like my hands to either smell or have that heat on there. I'm going to put the onions in the red salsa, and then I'm gonna go ahead and clean up my workstation, and we're gonna start on the tomatoes. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and just stir it in. This green salsa is getting thicker, it just needs to get more of the water cooked off. That's almost ready. And then for our red salsa, everything's coming out really good. So I'm gonna stir in the onions. We're looking at 20 minutes to cook this so the onion flavor goes into the salsa and to cook off more water off the tomatoes. And then that gives us plenty of time to cut up the tomatoes and get ready for that last step. As you can see, like, this is gonna turn it from runny to nice and thick. Okay, now we just need a 15-minute timer. And during that 15 minutes, we're gonna get the table washed and put some towels in between and start prepping our jars. Man, that looks good. It looks nice and thick, huh?
That time for 15 minutes.
Thank you, Logan.
She fills these up. I come back over and wipe down the top before I put the lid on. Make sure there's no debris or liquid or anything else on the top of that, so that the rubber seal of the lid is right against the jar. And I don't put them on too tight. You need them snug, but not too tight. If they're too tight, the gas won't escape when they go into the water bath, and they'll blow apart. The jar will actually burst. If they're too loose, all the fluid will boil out of the jar. So you got kind of a balance there that you have to meet. And I have no idea what to say other than I've done it a few times. And I just bring them down till they touch and give them maybe a quarter of a turn until it feels right. It's not too tight. And then when they go in the water bath, you start seeing the air bubbles escape from here as the gases are cooking in here and as it's cooking under pressure. The jars need to come up to a minimum of a quarter of an inch headspace, which is from the top of the jar down about half of the neck. So we usually fill them right about to this molded lip. That gives just this much headspace, which ends up just about right. And that allows room for the air to escape and come out and give it room to suck down that vacuum. If it's too tight, it'll be harder for it to seal too. If you have it too full, you end up with not a good seal because there's too much food in the jar, and it actually during the boiling process pushes up against the lid and works into the seal, and then it doesn't seal well.
So while I'm filling the jars, Mark is gonna also get the water bath ready in between, and then we can get that going. So as soon as we have about 7 jars, we'll be ready to start water bathing them.
Last jar. It holds 7 quart jars, and it's in there. The water is just above the lid, so they're fully encased, and they'll bubble out the lid as they get up to temperature. So now that we've got it in there, we'll set a timer for 15 minutes to boil with that water bath, and then we'll pull them out and put in the next batch. Make sure and top off the water so that we got them fully submerged. Now that we've got our other big pot empty, we'll go ahead and wash it up. It's the same size as this, so we'll get it washed up and get it full of water so we can do double time with the jars. A lot of jars to process.
We started at 10 a.m. with all of the produce, and we are now wrapping up, and it's a little past 5 o'clock. Make it worthwhile, get a big pot, get a ton of produce, and just do it all at once.
All right, I just swapped these jars out, and it was a little bit low from boiling, so I had to add more water, which cools it down. I'd rather they all come up to temperature evenly rather than put hot jars in cold water or vice versa, cold jars in hot water, because that increases the risk of the jar bursting in the water. I put them both together and brought them up to temperature evenly. So that's getting up there. I've got the second pot started so that it can start getting hot, and then I'll load that with 7 jars and we'll keep isolating back and forth to get them going. While that's happening, I'm gonna start our pepper sauce, which this is almost entirely Anaheim peppers. There's a couple of peppers in the mix that might be a little spicy, but I'm gonna just chunk those down into pretty good sized chunks with the seeds and the veins and everything. Just take the tops off of them essentially. And then I'm gonna start cooking that down with a little bit of vinegar and salt and water to keep it consistency. And once it gets all cooked down and everything's cooked for a while and the peppers are nice and tender, then I'll run the whole thing through the Vittorio strainer with the fine screen, and that will push all the meat and pulp and juice out through the sieve and take all the peels and the seeds and force them out the end. And then I'll be left with a really nice consistency of pepper sauce that I can add the salt and vinegar quality to get the flavor just right. And then we'll jar it up, and that will act as a enchilada sauce. And sometimes I like to use that as a stew base, where I'll put that in instead of a tomato base, and I'll add the pepper and the meat and some water, and we'll cook down the stew with that and have a pepper base instead, and it's really tasty. Peppers are cooked down. There's 2 cups of vinegar and 3 quarts of water and a ½ cup of salt, just to get them cooking and soften them up real nicely. I'm gonna let it cool for just a little bit before I get after it because I don't want to burn myself. I'm gonna pour it into our Vittorio strainer, pour those through here, and I've got the fine sieve on here, a really fine screen. So as I crank that through, the peels and the seeds will come out here, and all the meat pulp and the juice will come out here into the tub. And then I'll put it back into the pot and get it warming up and cook it for flavor at that point. If I need to add a little bit of lemon juice or vinegar, salt, whatever it needs just to get it. I'm not trying to make some crazy flavor. I want it to be peppers. That's the flavor, that's the target. Just enough vinegar and lemon to create a good acidity so that it preserves well and make sure that we've got a good flavor to that. Sometimes the lemon citrus flavor just adds a little bit of an enhancement. Same with the salt. Otherwise, I want the acidity high so that it'll jar well with just water bath jarring. Boys finished up the last couple of trays to get this dehydrator going. So that's all plums. Got them halved, pulled the pits out, and we've got that full set of trays going at 135 degrees. It'll probably take about 10 to 15 hours to dry out fully, so they're good. And once they get dried just well enough that after they're cooled down and they're cold, as long as they're not sticky to the touch, then we can bag them up and put them in Ziploc bags. And then they're shelf stable. We tend to keep some of our dehydrated stuff like fruits in the freezer sometimes just as a precaution. This is a different type of plum than the earlier ones we did. These are a lot meatier and they're perfect for prunes because that extra meatiness helps bind it together and keep it all locked in for a really nice texture. Ooh! Apparently some of those small Anaheims were actually Hungarian wax. There's a little bit of kick to that. Because of that, I'm not gonna jar it up the way I was planning. I was gonna do it as just a nice pepper sauce, but instead I'm gonna put it into pint jars. I'll cook it down just a little bit more. If it's just a little bit thicker, it'll be just right. And we're gonna pack it up as hot sauce. That's really good.